Sheila, what's your account? And I also want to welcome also Ambassador Laurent for his coming. Thank you very much for coming. Sheila, would you like to?
Well, I actually don't agree with the premise that Doha has failed. Doha wasn't intended primarily to be a negotiating round. It had two main purposes and a slightly subsidiary one. The first one was to show unity. It took place immediately after 9/11. It was the first major multilateral conference after 9/11. It was supposed to show that the world was still in reasonable shape and still able to make progress and to come together. The second purpose it had was to avoid action on agriculture. Under the previous round, there was supposed to be a reopening of negotiations on services and on agriculture after 5 years. Services would not have been a problem. There were some advances on individual services, and that could have been done as a separate round if people had wanted to, and some people did. But agriculture was an area where the US and the EU were going to have to make concessions with nothing to gain in return, except higher income, of course. And this was not something they wanted to do. The only way to avoid this was to say we must discuss other things as well, and therefore have a full-scale round. But this is not the same as the genesis of any of the preceding rounds, which all came because some country, some private sector actually wanted something desperately in the negotiation. The Doha round is the first one which was started because some countries desperately didn't want something to happen. The final reason, the sort of the WTO institutional one, was to show that the WTO cared about development. Seattle had been rather a shock to the WTO system, and the feeling that developing countries were somehow excluded was very much in the minds of the WTO officials and trade officials more generally, so we had to do something to look as if we were caring about development. This was actually turned out to be one of the problems. I agree very much with Guy's point that in the past we've always sort of looked at trade as still trade on the grounds of self-interest, and I would still do this. But by calling the Doha round a development round, we tied our hands in this. And the whole thing was presented as a hair shirt, not as a benefit. And people on the whole don't go out of their way to negotiate hair shirts. Obviously, there are difficulties for all multilateral initiatives at the moment, but I think the WTO has been surprisingly immune to this. It's done, if you look at trade and protection, trade in goods and trade in services of those which are included under the WTO have largely escaped a large increase in protection since the recession. And this is completely different even from minor recessions such as the 1970s and certainly from the 1920s and the 1930s. There has been an increase in protection in areas which are not yet under the WTO, in migration, in investment, in financial services. But on the whole, the WTO safeguarded areas have been safeguarded. So the WTO has continued to be successful from that point of view. And of course, the dispute procedure has continued, and that could have broken down. Disputes procedures and official things have broken down in recessions before. That didn't. So, and if you look at the WTO in trade more generally, it has continued to act in a reasonably efficient way. No one has left the WTO. That's not a bad record given other international problems. I'm afraid I think that the whole Plan B idea is totally unrealistic. As was mentioned by, I think, by someone else, Monday and Tuesday this week there was a conference about aid for trade at the WTO. And even the international organizations which have to pay lip service to Doha didn't, on the whole. It got very few mentions, even the usual pro forma of course, we're all in favor of Doha. The only person who did mention it very strongly was the president of the World Bank, Zelek, who said effectively that a good outcome, a major outcome from Doha isn't going to be any harder to get than a small outcome, because you actually need to have something big on the table to interest countries and make them negotiate. And he made the point that the US and the EU were now cutting things like agricultural subsidies for internal budget reasons, so they might as well do it and try to get some concessions in exchange. I agree with him that a big one isn't any more difficult to get than a small one, But to put it another way, a small one is going to be just as difficult to get as a big one. So I really don't think that that is likely. I'm not sure about the relevance of the FTAs, which both Dirk and Ganesh mentioned. The thing about FTAs and regional agreements more generally is, on the whole, they are for different purposes from something like a multilateral trade negotiation. They are for trade facilitation, for making trading easier among the members. They are for things which are not yet covered by the WTO, for investment, for sometimes areas like more services, competition policy, and so on. And above all, they tend to be, well, for the same reason as the original GATT, for security reasons. They are formed by countries which are friends and therefore which want to increase their trade, rather than by countries which basically are only interested in trading with each other. So they're a different sort of thing, and I don't think they're really a substitute for it. If we look ahead now, what is actually happening in the world trading system, what will be happening over the next 10 years, and what are the important questions, and can the WTO deal with them? Agriculture remains a problem, we all know that. To me, it's a tragedy that we wasted the crisis, to borrow a phrase. It is really inexcusable that at a time when countries, the EU and the US in particular, were trying to cut government spending, that they didn't cut government spending of the most inefficient sort. But unfortunately, we're in a sense past that now, or maybe not. But that is still definitely on the table. So any international institution, any international solution must deal with agriculture. But there are two others. One is conflicts among rule systems, or just discrepancies among rule systems. Trade and climate, trade and intellectual property, trade and exchange rates are all the traditional ones. One country's set of assumptions to another country's, one region's to another region's. This sort of borderline problem remains and is something which is going to have to be dealt with by the international system in some way or another. And finally, the change in the structure of the world, the emergence of new powers, which are very much, which has changed the whole structure of who trades with whom, where things are produced, and what people expect to happen. Can the WTO deal with this? Well, certainly not through the Doha round. None of these things is on the agenda of the Doha round, even if we manage to revive it. The Doha round is a 1999 agenda, and it really is not terribly interesting now. But what can it do? Well, it can carry on doing what it's doing. As I said, the disputes procedure has been extremely successful, even during the recession, even during the difficulties of the Doha round. And legislation through judicial activism is something which has been used in other cases where one couldn't get legislation through legislative activism. We've clarified the rules on regions. We've reformed anti-dumping. We've reformed some agricultural subsidies, all through the disputes procedure. Other things could be done there. The rules on the notification of standards, the most boring bit of the WTO, very important. It has made things much more transparent for individual traders. That sort of thing can be much more important than a lot of the things which are on the Doha agenda. And, as has already been mentioned, aid for trade. And we were saying before this meeting, the interesting thing about aid for trade is, at a time when aid has been under considerable pressure, at a time when trade has been under pressure, at a time when agreements have been under pressure, earlier this week, we were worrying about how quickly aid for trade was increasing. Now, there's not many types of aid, not many types of trade where that's the sort of problem which you face. So somehow the WTO and commitment to the WTO has kept that on the agenda. I don't think the WTO has used its monitoring power sufficiently well, but the framework is there, and again, one could move forward. But what can the WTO do about the new issues? Just two very quick points on that. One, the WTO principles are something which several of the other international issues haven't really adopted and could use very productively. Most favored nation. In other words, don't discriminate among your trading partners, or among your climate partners, or among your exchange rate and financial and all the other agreements. And secondly, national treatment. Treat foreign traders or whatever who are active in your country in the same way as national. Those two principles actually go quite a long way to setting a framework, not just in trade, and I think could be used more. The one problem which I think probably does arise of structure isn't the one which Ganesh put of trying to get majorities. I think it's more fundamental than that. The WTO, and this is true of some of the other international institutions, isn't set up to do small things. It isn't set up to make a particular regime slightly better. Everything has to go back to a full-scale negotiation, in a sense, from first principles. Bringing in ways to make small advances won't replace rounds, but it could allow longer intervals between rounds without our becoming as worried.